Well, The Visual Time Traveller, Aileen, is a book primarily, but a very beautiful and a very unusual coffee table book. Its ambition was to cover 500 years of history. So it runs from the Renaissance right up to the time it was published, which was 2013. And to do that, to cover history of such a broad time span, I divided it into 100 5-year time jumps. So starting from 1500, going on to 1505, 1510, I curated 12 facts that happened within each 5-year time period. So there was a list of facts, including sports, politics, literature, women's affairs, general history. So there was no one specific line that I was taking in terms of the history. But once I had the 12 facts that would go on each of these 5-year time periods, I gave them to some designers and I asked them how would they visually imagine that these 12 facts could be represented. And I gave them huge freedom with that. They could illustrate one of the facts, they could illustrate a couple of the facts. And really the great thing for me was sometimes they managed to get 2 or 3 facts into quite a clever illustration. So that's the kind of essence of how it works. 5-year time jumps spanning 500 years in 100 illustrations with the facts woven in. If you look at one 5-year time period, so from 1895 to 1900, I went off, did my research, found my 12 facts, and they included things like the first modern Olympics were held in that 5-year time period. Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, that play first had its airing. But also I discovered that Bram Stoker was writing Dracula, and he in Dublin, in my own city here. Same 5 years, I discovered that the drug aspirin was first isolated or invented. So the designers took these facts. I had these facts all included. It took me a while to get down to just 12, but they came back to me and showed me their design. And their design was a fabulous picture of Dracula in the background. And then down at Dracula's teeth, down at the right of them, there's a molecule. You know it's something scientific, but it's a little red molecule. And of course, it's the molecule for aspirin, which is derived from salicylic acid. So this was the clever way that they chose to help me communicate this history, because some people are just drawn to the visual, others just want to read straight away. And then most of us, do a little bit of both. So at a very quick glance, you're not going to know exactly what these 2 facts are. You might guess about the Dracula or the Bram Stoker, but the molecule, it's unlikely, unless you're very scientific, you'll immediately recognize that. So there's an example of one of the pages and then completely different to the other 99 pages. I would often go into the bookshop and I'd nearly have to ask them, look, which section is my book in? Because you might think, okay, it's flat, straightforward history, but it isn't really. And I've noticed in Hodges Figgis, who have been great supporters of me, that they put it in their Irish art section, which is a really nice place for it to be. And really the level of design that went into this and the approach, the fresh approach, the creative approach, there was so much love went into it, both from designers and from myself, that I've ended up with 100 really beautiful artworks, which is why I created an exhibition to go with it and a whole talk, because there's so much to unpack on this. You can stay on one page. I could talk about each page for a couple of hours. So that's a very good point about it. Hard to categorize. It's not a science book. It's not only a science book. It's not only an art book. It's not only a history book or a book about politics. Lots of women's stuff in there, but it's all of these things. And that's the kind of magic behind it and why it has such a broad audience. It was very important to me that it was a beautiful production. So much had gone into this artwork. I wasn't going to do a cheap version. So it was printed in the Netherlands, a very high-end art printer who would have published people like Damien Hirst and Saatchi and Saatchi. So very, very high-end. And he wouldn't have taken just any project. So a full litho print. A lot of trouble will have gone into this. About 8 plates, I suspect, for each page in the book to get the full colour. And so each page is a print. And then, as well as that, I had found this book before we went to publication, which had an uncovered spine. And it's an unusual thing if you haven't seen it, but a book where the cover doesn't run over the spine, where the back of the spine is you can see the threads, you can see how it is sewn together, because a good book is always sewn, it's not glued. And I said, look, I'd really love if you could do this with this book, because when you open the book, it just lands flat. It's this gorgeous way. In a lot of modern books, they kind of spring closed a little bit, and you want to push them down and flatten them, but you know you might break them. With this one, it's like you've two books, because as the page opens and it's divided in the middle, you've each side there. And one of the things, an awful lot of trouble went into the design to make this right, because that's not an easy thing to get those little, we're down to millimeters, right and correct. Because if, again, you think about any book, half of one page is not the same as the next page. The way a book is bound, and the leaves are all kind of inside each other. So it was a massive kind of thing that they did. And the printer, then he took a yellow thread to do the threading at the back. And that's a very particular thing. A printer won't just change the thread on his machine for anything. These are huge machines, these litho printers. So it's also got a beautiful cover. It's sort of, there's a sumptuousness to it. And when I brought the book into Hodges Figgis, where the buyer there had said he was going to buy some from me, I remember giving him, he was one of the first people to see a book, and he took it and he opened it and he buried his face into it and smelt it, which was just wonderful to see. And equally, the librarian in Trinity College Dublin, when I was bringing in my publisher copies that you have to give for copyright, she had the book in her hands, and I was explaining the whole project to her. And I actually have two versions of it. I have a collector's one and a regular one. And the collector's one, she had it in her arms and she was sort of stroking it with her hands. So book lovers just really enjoy that about this. And I wanted this experience to really move away from the online, to move away from the fast, the short attention span, the fact that everything is so almost one-dimensional on the screen these days, barely even two-dimensional in many ways. Yes, it is two-dimensional, but it's so flat. With a book, you touch it, you come back to it. When I read books these days, I actually take notes in the corner. I bend down the corner. So for me, the actual product was so important that people would love it. And people do. They come back to me and say how much they love this uncovered spine. A bit of a long story. But to maybe cut it very short, it was a very strong desire to be heard. As the youngest of a family of four, I think I wasn't always heard when I was younger. So this was one of the big factors. A very personal journey too. My mother died when I was young, actually when I was just 12, unexpectedly to me. And in many ways, I think that at the back of my mind, this book was for myself as a 12-year-old, but also for my mum, who never knew I did it. And the sort of love that went into it was for myself and for her. But then I guess if you look at my background, I'm a teacher. I studied maths and economics in college. I love to explain. I love seeing somebody switch on to something, especially mathematics. It's an amazing thing to have that power to explain to somebody and for somebody to then own that power. And what happened with this book was me having been somebody who didn't really like history, and I would have said wasn't good at all at history, I kind of found a way to become quite good at history and a way to communicate that to other people, that you can sort of get into it. And I really did begin to get into it as history began to make sense to me. And I really began to see the flow as I was working through the 16th century, when you go from 1500 up to 1600 and you begin to see how science is nudging at religion. And then you see during the Enlightenment how they really are throwing light on things. They're finding evidence. They're doing big science experiments to prove things, so that once you've seen it with your eyes or heard it, you have to believe it. And the whole mystery of religion is just gradually being pushed to one side. But that took 500 years, as we know. And then on into the Industrial Revolution, and then the huge specialization that began to happen with modernism. And that for me was really this feeling of synthesizing, a lot of things about history. And this piecemeal approach, just breaking it down into the 5 years, was a really great way to do it, because I haven't picked the 12 facts that somebody else would have picked, but yet there's a universality to it. You might have picked, 4 or 5 of the same facts, then you might have had your own little quirky one you wanted to include. But I think that's the joy of it, because anybody reading this book or looking at this book would sort of think, well, what would I have done? What 12 facts would I put? And what design might I have liked? So the book can exist in other iterations, which is kind of, again, a kind of magic about it. I think I might put that into 3 categories at the moment. So parents are buying it for their kids because the kids don't have the money to buy it. But the interesting thing with kids, and I've hit the mark with the sort of 10 to 12-year-old so many times, it's intriguing to me. The kids get this book sometimes quicker than the adults. It's a little bit like the modern internet. Young people are just so switched on, and they're very capable of thinking of things in different ways. So that jump between the visual and the literal is no problem for somebody young, and they're so driven by the visual now. That's a very easy thing. Whereas my age group and older people are very often, show me the manual. I just want to read from A to B to C to D. And that to me can hold you back. So parents are buying it for their kids. And in fact, one of the talks I gave in a primary school, a young girl called Alice, this is before the book was even published. She completely got switched on by the whole concept. She ran up to me afterwards, was asking me questions, but she went home to her parents and said she wanted this book for her 10th birthday. And they had to hunt it down for her. She came to my first talk as well and asked a question. And twice now and more than twice actually, I've had parents tell me that their young daughter or son has had the book with them up in bed and they've had to nearly wrestle it off them. So it tends to suit all of the family. And like watching something like The Simpsons, kids will get a different thing out of it to that which adults will get, because we know our history. I mean, any adult is often curious about, for example, the 5 years they were born. I was myself. That was a very important page for me, 1960 to 1965.